Hey, ¿qué pasa, Calexico? Welcome back to the podcast. Before we begin today, I want to thank my sponsors, my anchor sponsors, who are my homies from Los Pichos, Jake, Sergio, and Jonathan. Also, want to thank David Gastelum. If you're looking to buy or selling a home, make sure you contact David Gastelum at, let me look for his number. His number is somewhere here. His number is 760-235-9576. So give him a call if you're looking for a house in the Imperial and San Diego counties. Today's guest is a multi-talented girl. She wears many hats. She's an author. She's an activist. She is a professor and an author, believe it or not. Miss Karla Cordero, thank you for being here today.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I mean, I was telling Karla earlier that, I ran into her because of Instagram. I clicked on the Calexico, #Calexico, and I ran into her, and then I started, going through her stuff. Sometimes I feel like a creep because I feel like I know these people because of their Instagram or their stories, and it's just my way to kind of like find, local talent and
Sure.
Discover all these, gems that are out here that people really might not know, because I feel that here in the Valley, we're a little bit behind when it comes to like the technology, whether it's podcasting or, social media. We might use social media for the wrong reasons, like for the chismes and whatnot. But, it's good to like use it for a better use, like, finding local talent, supporting local talent mainly.
Absolutely.
But yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you're a Calexico native.
Yes, born and raised. Well, raised in Calexico, born in El Centro. I always like to start off with, I am the daughter of Yolanda Garcia Cordero and the daughter of Alfonso Gerardo Cordero. The descendants of my people from northern parts of Mexico, from the indigenous folks of, which is the tribe that's called Chichimeca, Maria Luisa, and the Spaniard that she married into named Rafael Luis. So I love to start grounding myself with like the ancestors and my familia, as those are kind of the bloodstreams and the histories of where, my upbringings and my identity and so forth. But to ground it more to like of a landscape, raised in Calexico my whole life till the age of 18, and then made the decision to access education outside of the Imperial Valley. And then continued on with my academic journey in San Diego, and here I am now on a podcast with you, all the way from Carlsbad, California, which is about 2.5 hours from Calexico.
Yeah, it's crazy that we could do this, through the magic of technology, right?
I know, I love it. It's great.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that, I kind of, like I said, I kind of feel like I know Karla, but this is the first time we actually like kind of met, and I guess like in person. We've been talking on Instagram back and forth because we've been trying to schedule this, but yeah, I mean, I've usually this weekend I saw this guy. He's like, "Oh, I listened to your podcast," and you interview people that I have no idea who they are, but they have a lot of good information. Mm-hmm. And you kind of like ask like really good questions. And, I tell them like, what, a lot of people think that, I just go in and start interviewing people like willy nilly, but I do my research. I really like try to come up with really good questions to, have a flow of conversation. So, that's why I feel like I kind of like know the people that I kind of interview. And, going back to what, the things that you do, you're a poet, which is mainly, one of the, biggest things you're doing right now. Cause, I'll get into, some of the things that are happening right now, but I'll get into that right now. But I just want to ask you, like, have you always been like this, creative? Like, were you always like into writing, or is it just something that later age or when you went to college? How do you get into, the writing part?
Sure. I would have to say creativity was inherited, was an inheritance early on. My father was a manager of a hardware store called Imperial Hardware. And my mother was part of a family business called Garcia Foods.
Okay.
And so, and so these were two spaces that had an abundance of freedom in creating worlds and having wild imaginations. And so those were spaces where me and my sisters would go very often, and my parents would just call that daycare while they were working. So being in those spaces gave us the freedom to just play. Home, since, the Imperial Valley is very desert, agricultural based. One of the other things that my parents always encouraged regarding creativity is like the idea of using the earth as canvas. And so my father would always bring like seeds back from the hardware store, or I'd get some frijoles from the cupboard and like break the earth and work the clay in our backyards. And I love the creativity of growing stuff. So I think primarily my first calling of artist is, making things from the earth. I love growing my own food, love seeing a flower blossom. So I would just say the creativity at a very young age is like growth. And having my parents always give me, paint, chalk, construction paper. I mean, we had to be very creative, considering the limitations and access of the arts and cultura that was available in Calexico. And so I can recall taking construction paper and cutting snowflakes in the living room and then tacking them outside on the walls because we had no access to what snow looked like. So creativity has always been embedded my whole life. I think the creativity as like poet or poesia, came in later on when I was working on my undergraduate work at Cal State San Marcos. When I was taking a literature class, and various professors have been encouraging me to take creative writing courses because they had seen potential in the stories and the kind of folks that were being birthed into like visibility in the narrations I had been telling. And then from there, the education system played a huge role in kind of resurrecting the poetess, I guess one could say. But yeah, I do photography, write poetry, short stories, grow stuff. I love making things, so I would say it's been there since the moment of birth.
Yeah, and what about the sense of your culture, like the sense of being would you consider yourself a Chicana, or what's your what would you consider yourself your nationality, or like how do you identify yourself?
Sure. That's an important question, but it's a really, really complicated question to ask, right? So when I understood the complexity of that question was through a poem by an amazing poet who was also my mentor. His name is Willy Perdomo, and he wrote a poem called Where I'm From. And someone questions him, a female character questions the speaker, where are you from? And it's not a quick answer regarding his identity. It is this expanded answer of the complexity and the intersectionality of one's identity. So I would say, there is a layering to how I identify, and know that the titles I give you are very limiting in understanding. But I think growing up in the Imperial Valley, I was always like Mexican or Latina or, the Pocha Latina. But I had always been surrounded by 98% folks that identified as like border child, or that lived in Mexicali, or that grew up in the Imperial Valley. So the majority were always like Spanish speaking, Mexican, indigenous. But when I moved up to San Diego, I would argue that my identity had shifted with this idea of understanding Chicana, and Chicana as a state of consciousness and a reclamation of what it means to be female, what it means to reinstate oneself in a position of empowerment where you've been raised across not only a literal but a metaphorical border, and acknowledging the oppressions and the celebrations of what those identities carry, and understanding the complexities of what it means who embody all of that at the same time. And I can go on and on and on with feeling like the identity of self, right? One can go across religion, the multiplicity of the languages we possess in our tongue, femininity, gender, and so forth. But I'm gonna just lay that groundwork for now as like the basis of like what I identify.
Even that like kind of blew my mind. But I mean, because last week I spoke to Roberto Pozos. He's an artist from Calexico, and he's based in San Diego. And I asked him the same question, and he kind of give me a shorter answer, which is kind of like a state of mind of identifying as a Chicano or not. And then I sent my a coworker who was a Chicano studies teacher at the Calexico High School, and I sent them the podcast. He's like, you know what, that guy said what I'm teaching my kids. He kind of like regurgitated everything I'm trying to teach my kids. I'm like, oh, that's cool. So you guys are in the same track, so it's kind of cool that, because what I was telling Roberto last week was that, to me, not that I don't identify myself as something, but living here in Calexico, kind of like we're in this limbo where like we really don't experience like the we don't, I guess, since we don't really need to, we don't go beyond we're just here,
right.
So like if we want to have a taco, we go to Mexicali. We're gonna have a burger, we'll just stay here. Like it's that limbo, like we really don't identify as something. So it's kind of like, and Roberto said this kind of the same thing. Like it took him having to move to a bigger city to kind of like understand where or have that feeling of being outcasted or not being in your comfort zone as Mexican culture. So
right, there's definitely a level of comfort staying in the Imperial Valley. Not that that's a bad thing, but it really doesn't push you into a position where you kind of question like where you fit in all of this, because you've always fit in some way, but definitely when you move out of the Imperial Valley, your body and your identity, based on who you are, gets questioned in various ways. And so now, as an individual, you're kind of reaching for a lexicon of language on how to label that yourself, when you're just like, oh, I'm just like a kid from Calexico, and they're like, well, where's that at? And that's where the complexity happens, where you're like, you don't know where that's at, and so absolutely.
Yeah. I tell people like we're kind of like San Isidro, but smaller, way smaller.
Yeah, definitely way smaller.
So sorry. So you're a professor now, are you?
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm not gonna ask your age because my mom taught me at a very young age not to ask a woman her age. But I know you're young because you're a couple years younger than I am, and I feel like I'm a young person myself. But so you went through. Did you graduate from San Diego State or?
Good question. So when figuring out the journey of what I wanted to do with a career, I was still kind of figuring things out, and I went first to Palomar College, which is a community college in San Marcos, California. So I journeyed through there and got my AA in social behavioral sciences, and then transferred and got my bachelor's at Cal State San Marcos in liberal studies with an emphasis in literature and writing, and then pursued my master's in fine arts with an emphasis in poetry, and a lot of my research-based work was on like trauma and healing and coping mechanisms through poetic aesthetics, through I guess for individuals or communities of historically underrepresented folks who have encountered these kinds of traumas, and how poetry can access, again, healing and liberation, right? And so that was kind of the journey of what I went through in accessing like education, and then trying to figure out a career in that. A master's in fine arts is a terminal degree, which allows you to then teach at the university and community college level. So I was really blessed to kind of get through all my education and then go immediately into teaching at San Diego State University for about 2 years.
Oh, wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, you're where people are like, "What? You're a professor? Like you're a young person?" Were they taken aback?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Anytime I walk in the first day of class, my students are always being punked. They're like, "This is a professor?" I go, "Yep, I'm a professor." And they're like, "How old are you?" I go, "Is that what you know?" So it's always a really fun. I always enjoy the first day of class because we have these stigmas and assumptions or stereotypes of what your professor looks like, this older person that possesses all this wisdom and knowledge. But in reality, that's ageism at full effect, and
Yeah. I mean, I grew up watching Doogie Howser, so
yeah,
it was great.
young.
So you're also a editor for Spit Journal.
Yes.
So what can you tell us a little bit about what Spit Journal is?
Sure. So Spit Journal manifested so when I moved up to San Diego, when I was doing my undergraduate work, one of my professors had encouraged me encouraged the class as a project to go out into the community and to see what folks were doing with literature. So I recall it being just this laborious, unwanted task, but I had seen a flyer that said a poetry slam in Encinitas over by Del Mar. So I attended, and I was visualizing like a bunch of white dudes, spitting Shakespearean sonnets, and I was just ready to get this assignment done and over with. I was like, cool, let's do this. But when I went, it was this friendly competition through poetry, where a bunch of amazing poets that looked like me were spitting poems in 3 minutes or less about like where they're from, the celebration of self, the challenges they face with their identity, speaking of visibility into their communities. And so I remember seeing the event and I was completely blown away. I was laughing and I was crying, and I knew by the end of the event, I was like, I want to figure out how to do that. Like that looks interesting. It was just so empowering that I needed to figure out how to do that. So I went about my way on writing my own little poems and trying to figure out how to replicate that same platform, that same power, and lots of different things, interventions happening along the way. I eventually found out that San Diego has an underground following for spoken word poetry. So San Diego always sends out a team of 5 poets to go compete at what's called the National Poetry Slam, which is no longer a competition. There are different competitions that exist now for other reasons, but I went ahead and tried out and made the team, and I was the first Chicana, the first female to ever represent the team, especially coming out of the Imperial Valley, and with the stories of what it means to be a migrant, what it means to be undocumented, what it means to be from Calexico. And so in 2013, I represented my city in San Diego, and we went to nationals at Boston, where we competed against 75 teams across the nation. And we came in 4th. And that was the first time, or one of the first times San Diego had made final stage. A final stage meaning the top, I believe it's the top 5 teams, if I recall correctly, to kind of battle it out through these competitions. The way the scoring goes is they select 5 random judges, and this is to kind of provide a reclamation for poetry in the hands of the community, where then they score your poem from a 0 to 10. They'll then remove the highest and lowest score, and the 3 middle scores are going to be the poet's initial score for the poem. There are also group pieces where poets, plural, can perform a poem on stage and so forth. And so when I had gone to Boston, I had met all of my heroes that I had seen on YouTube, spitting poems that were amazing. And I remember being in the elevator with a poet I had loved for so long. He was from New York, and we both ended up in the elevator together, and I was starstruck, and I was like, okay, say something. And I was like, hi, I love your work. And he was like, dope, thank you. And he goes, I want you to know that I'm a superstar here, but when I go back home, I'm a janitor cleaning bathrooms. And I was like, oh my God, like that really stuck with me.
Mm-hmm.
So when I returned back to San Diego, and I was then working in the education system, I wanted to bridge a platform for that community of folks, for the poet who hasn't had the eyes of appreciation beyond that scene. I wanted to create a platform where we could celebrate poets from all over the country, and inform, a wider audience about the really exciting things that they're doing in their community, or the new book that's out, or having really intimate interviews with these folks and having that accessible. An extra layer to that is, and this is all coming out of on Spit Journal. And spit journal meaning in the community, when you're about to do a poem, they're like, spit your truth, like, do you. And so I wanted to kind of keep the colloquialism of our community with this idea of like spit journal, where we are, spitting and baptizing you in the truth of poetry and performance and social justice and cultural competency and diversity. So Spit Journal archives a lot of those stories and interviews. In addition, I'm also doing short interview snippets that now focus pedagogy, teaching methods that we can integrate into the classroom. How can we use the power of performance poetry and spoken word in the classroom to empower our students and to allow them to kind of engage with their voices if they haven't had the opportunity to do so. So essentially, Spit Journal now exists as a platform available to anybody and everybody, a platform for artists to contact us, and we can proceed with interviews, and for educators who are looking for ways on how to integrate the art form into the classroom.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. Yeah, I mean, because a lot of times, like you said, well, I mean, it's a good way to give these people a platform to, and then at the same time, community of educators to, have somewhere to reach out and exchange ideas as to how to, implement these kind of things into the classroom. That's pretty cool.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I kind of skip over, but you want the diversity award for San Diego State, right?
Yes, I did.
And can you tell us a little bit about what that award is and how did it come about to you winning it?
Absolutely. I cannot recall the year I won it, but I know I was still working on my master's. And so while you're working on your master's at San Diego State, they give you the option of, while you are working on your master's, if you want to do a teaching track. And so teaching track means taking courses that are pedagogy focused, and they can throw you into a classroom and they're like, here are your students, teach rhetoric and writing 100. So in creating curriculum for teaching students, I wanted to implement what's called student service learning. Student service learning being where students are taking theory into practice and contributing that back into the community. And I wanted to do that with performance poetry and spoken word, since that was something that really transformed my life in knowing the power of language and what words can do. So I created a spoken word showcase, which is called Voice for Change. It's a spoken word showcase where we invite nationally award-winning spoken word artists to perform their narratives on survival, celebration of diversity, cultural competency. And so since I had gone to nationals for the team when we went to go compete, I had made these connections with all these amazing artists from across the country. So then, since I'm now teaching, I had access to funds to bring these folks onto campus and available to the community. So the way it would work is I would teach curriculum in the classroom that was either poetry, social justice focused, or a novel in which a student is inspired, or the young protagonist is inspired through writing. And at the end of the event, or at the end of the semester, students are invited to community organize, market, and put together a voice for change. So we would collaboratively select an artist who would come perform. And before the main feature, students were then invited to use a lot of their homework assignments and then perform those pieces on stage. So my students would initially be the opening act,
Mm-hmm.
and they would perform. And then our closing performer was the invited artist. We also integrate Q&A with the performer. We also integrate workshops and curriculum with the visiting performer or performers for professional development and interaction with our students. And so when word had gone around that this part-time professor was doing all this work, plus curriculum, plus being a student in the master's program, I believe it was one of my chairs in my department had nominated me for the award. And the turnout was I had won, and the acknowledgement was just the work I had been doing with social justice, poetry, and curriculum in the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it was a lot of work to, bring all these, pieces together to kind of like do all these things that you were doing with the, not only with the speakers, but with the students, like to put something like that and still being a student and still teaching. And it's like, wow, it's crazy. Like, did you have a life during that time or?
I had no life. I still don't, but I mean, yeah, I would fly a lot of these folks. So I was booking plane tickets, booking hotels. I was their Uber, getting them lunch, making sure they're fed, making sure my students feel comfortable in community organizing and performing the day up. So there was a multiplicity of roles that I was playing, and I was just real blessed. I was able to multitask as I could to make it happen for my students and for the campus.
When you come back to Calexico, do you feel that our youth here is do you think they could be more involved in terms of like politics and kind of like serving that community in that sense where they they know what's going on and
Sure.
what do you?
Yeah, it's really hard for me to answer that. The simple fact is that I'm not engaging with the youth when I return to the Imperial Valley. I think that's been a calling that I need to kind of figure out, facilitate a way to be in communication with the youth of the Imperial Valley and Calexico. So I'm not able to kind of measure or answer whether the students are engaged. I know I just did a reading with another fabulous poet. His name's Paul Manuel Lopez, who's also a poet local to the Imperial Valley, and we did a reading for San Diego State University down in Calexico. And it was I believe it was a Chicana Studies focus course, and a couple English courses came in to listen. And a lot of our conversations were about how poetry or how art can establish a visibility for a people. And I recall me engaging with our youth, with our students there, and saying, like, where's the art? Where are the murals? Where are the art exhibits? Where are the art galleries? Where is the archiving of our histories and our ancestors? So I can only speak from like a visual observation in Calexico, is that we're very limited in the visibility of the arts that represent our youth.
Yeah.
But aside from that, I don't know the work that our educators down there are putting in,
well, I mean,
or the events that are happening.
Because I work at the high school. I'm a computer tech there, and kind of like just mingling around with the kids. And I have a son who's a senior as well. And I kind of feel like they don't really, they're not involved as much as with the community. And just because I asked the same question to Roberto last week, and he said that he felt that just the youth in general aren't as involved with them, and even with their culture. I feel like in general they're not really involved. They're just distracted with other things. Maybe I don't know what you think, but yeah, I feel like there's other things that they're distracted with, that they don't really pay much attention to keeping up with their culture and the way that the politics in our country are kind of like going and affecting our culture. So I don't know, just something that I thought maybe you might want to change.
I mean, no, there's definitely some truth in that, and just the observation of the students I get in my classrooms. I think there's definitely this huge distraction with technology and social media that capitalism is keeping our students occupied with, that are kind of keeping them busy from what's really happening. And so I think social media and the internet and technology have done a really good job of keeping our youth busy and distracted. And I think that's where education plays a huge role in giving them that level of wokeness of, there's more to Facebook, there's more to a like, did you notice that your community is housing or sheltering X amount of undocumented folks? Do you know, X, Y, and Z? When was the last time you read a newspaper? So I definitely will agree that our youth are definitely very distracted and are forgetting to do a check-in with their community and how they can give back to their communities with their own talents and their own abilities of what they can do and bring to the table.
Yeah, and Roberto also says he's an artist and he likes painting murals and stuff like that. He did mention the lack of art in our community, and he did mention that if the city will be willing to like have a place where they can do like an office space where they can do murals on the walls, he would be willing to come down and teach the kids and maybe do some murals every so often. So I do have a connection with the city manager, so I think I'm going to bring that up soon, and maybe we could even have a poetry reading and stuff like that. So I'll keep you posted. Maybe we can recruit some people.
And then the other thing we need to think about is we need a space for our youth to be artists. So I don't know if I haven't investigated if San Diego State in Calexico has an art gallery, but that's still a limitation of who has access. But what I've noticed up here regarding the arts, in Vista, Oceanside, Barrio Logan, is that they always have a space for the youth to be artists and to speak and a space of expression. And I think those are one of the things that I haven't investigated enough, but I think that is missing in the Imperial Valley, is a space for our youth to be safe and to create fearlessly and to have that presented on the walls. I think that's another thing. Being
at the high school, there's an art teacher there, Eddie Schiffer. He's done murals for the wall here, or the gate, the fence, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
So those murals, he was part of the painting those murals there, and he's a teacher at the high school. So he's doing a lot of good work with the kids at the high school. And I know that they have after school they have a little art club, and I think this weekend they went over they were in Balboa Park, and they were visiting the art center there and stuff like that. So I mean, there is people that would be really interested. So hopefully I can be a vessel to maybe getting that into motion and having that in place, and hopefully you can come down and do some reading stuff like that.
Yeah. When y'all are ready, let us know. We'll be coming down by the hundreds and helping Calexico make that happen.
So talking about reading, let's talk about your book.
Hey, you got a copy! Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, I was keeping it a secret because I wanted to surprise you with it.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
So yeah, you have a book called How to Pull Apart the Earth.
Yes.
And it's a collection of how many? Around how many poems are in?
I would say maybe I can't remember right now. It's somewhere in the 50s. Okay. 50 count, más o menos.
And I've been doing some research on the book, and a lot of the poems are really, especially being somebody from Calexico, there's some that you really relate to, especially like La Llorona. I used to live right next to the canal, so La Llorona was a big thing to us growing up.
Absolutely.
And then I think one of my favorites is the when my mom gave me the chancla for letting Andrew Jackson escape out the window.
Yeah.
Especially right now that it's 110, it's really relatable. What can you tell us about your book?
Sure. So I'm really excited I announced it on social media, but How to Pull Apart the Earth just won the San Diego Book Award. So it's been recognized as a winner for the San Diego Book Awards. We also just got the announcement today that we are a winning finalist in the International Book Awards.
Congratulations on those two.
Thank you so much. And I always tell my press, like, this is not an individual win. This is like a win for our people in our city, as many of the poems and the prose narrative poems that are archived in the book are really about the representation of like our familia and our cultura and the borderlands of the Imperial Valley. And again, who gets stuck along those lines and who has access to the American dream and what the American dream looks like, and so forth. And so the book essentially manifested when I was doing my master's program. What is required during your master's program or in your MFA is that you work essentially on a manuscript, which is a book or a collection of poetry. And so when I had finished my master's, I remember telling my professors, I don't have a book yet. I don't feel comfortable that I've completed a book, but there were a solid amount of poems that I had felt proud of. And so after I had finished my master's, then I had found a community of folks where I was able to continue to investigate my homeland, the Imperial Valley, continue to do my readings and my research and producing more work and capturing a lot of the happenings in the politics of immigration and being a migrant and being a witness to those things. And so the poems continued to collect until I felt comfortable that I had a potential collection here for publication. The book was submitted to a manuscript contest for a press called Write Bloody. I was a finalist I was the top 10 under the finalists, but I didn't get the book deal. And then there was another press in Los Angeles called Not a Cult, and they're fabulous, where they had a competition open. So I said, why not? Submitted, made final round, then I ended up winning the contest. So I got a book deal with them, and the book was released in November of 2018. We had a big fiesta here in Oceanside at an art gallery called Link Soul. And so we put we had a call for art from Latinx, Chicanx artists, where we raised funds to support undocumented students and scholarships, as well as selling the book there and providing a % of that back to that scholarship. And so the book, essentially, the cover art, also real quick, was designed by an amazing artist here in Oceanside. His name is Juan Charlie Bees. He's a Latino artist who essentially goes to Oaxaca ever so often during the summer, and he would study a lot of the art or the observations he had been making, and he would take rubber. I can't remember the name of the material he uses, but it's like a rubber material, and he would hand carve stamps out of the images he would capture. And it was very magical surrealism, mystical, these characters with masks that would tell stories. And so when he had his first art show in Vista, I had seen an essential print that he had made. It was originally a calavera looking under the ground. And I knew immediately when I saw the piece, I had bought the piece. And then I said, I need this to manifest into my potential book cover. And so he handled the cover, the image on the cover, on the back cover, and there's a collection of, I think, 4 images in the book that he also designed that kind of capture some kind of foreshadowing to each unit within the book.
Mm-hmm. And the title, what is it? Like, how did you come up with the title?
Sure. So how to pull apart the earth, again, when I spoke earlier about being really obsessed with breaking apart the earth and attempting to make growth in a piece of land that essentially is dead and has no potential to produce like a harvest and so forth. So I think there's a multiplicity of meaning behind the title, but with the idea of first starting with the examination of poems that were taking place in a landscape such as the Imperial Valley, where we are known for our agriculture, but also acknowledging the folks that grow and pick the produce of our land, acknowledging the folks who are crossing the border and trying to access the American dream, and those who get it and those that don't. acknowledging that we have a cemetery where John Does are buried there for a number of folks that are undocumented. And so How to Pull Apart the Earth was this kind of examination of not just the literal landscape of the Imperial Valley, but also identity and intersectionality. The cover essentially is kind of its own version of almost like Alice in Wonderland, the rabbit that goes down the rabbit hole, and Alice chases after, and in that journey she's growing and shrinking and gets in trouble and denies motherhood, and tries to find the longing but is always othered. And so I wanted to bring in my own like Chicana, Latinx version of my own Alice in Wonderland, where we must unpack our origins, whether how messy or exciting they are, and to tell the stories that are hidden beneath the surface and that exploration.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, I've been reading through some of the poems, and some of them like kind of like a lot of poetry. It's kind of like, you know, you have to have that sense of but some of them are like really like, you know, like, what are you reading my mind? Like, because it's like it's like so Calexico. I mean, the Calexico poem is like, you know, I think like 99% of the Calexico people that grew up here will like identify with it, because it's, you know, it's such a, you know, detailed and I don't know, it hits home, you know.
Right.
And I saw the video. I didn't know you had made a video for that poem, and it's really, I really liked it. I really liked it a lot. How so you said it was through your masters that you kind of like acquired all these poems and to put into the book.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any of them that you kind of left out that you were like, well, maybe this one for another book or
Sure. Absolutely. When finishing my master's, I only had like the skeleton of the book. I think there were a lot of poems that I wrote that didn't make it in the book. When you put a collection of poetry together, there's a story to be told, and some poems were missing that needed to be told, and some poems felt redundant or didn't go with the fluidity of the story that was being told. Right, so those are kind of the decisions you make as an artist or as a poet or as a writer when putting a collection together, is like sacrificing the babies that aren't going to push the story forward or the character development forward. So there are definitely poems that were added, a lot of poems that were added, and poems that didn't make it in the collection.
And what does your family say about the book? What are their feelings and thoughts about it?
Sure. I think along the lines of what you had said earlier is that, you know, some of the poems you definitely have to have, or not have, but be familiar with the poetic voice of understanding that particular cadence or the particular language that is birthed in some of these pieces. And some of the poems are more accessible. They're more prose, story, understanding, or one can understand them through a more narrative perspective. And so I think essentially some of the poems, my parents are like, oh, you know, I understand this part, it's cute. And then they'll have more a clear understanding of the more narrative driven poems where they're like, wow, I understand this, I remember this particular memory. I'm trying to think of other comments they've made. Yeah, I mean, essentially the response with my parents have been super supportive. I was a closeted poet for a very long time, and so my mother had to sneak up to a poetry event to witness me share poetry, and that was kind of the discovery that I did this thing.
Yeah.
My mother drove from Calexico to San Diego to see me at a competition, and she was in the audience hiding. So from then on, I knew my parents were very supportive, but there's definitely a lot of dialogue that happens behind the scenes when writing about, you know, my family, our cultura, and making sure that they feel comfortable with those poems being released into the world. My family on a larger scale are super supportive, and I'm glad to just have that support.
You talk about the cadence, and that was something I kind of wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
Because I've done stand up like a couple of times, and even for stand up, it's kind of like there's a pace as to how you tell your joke,
Yeah.
There's this because essentially stand up is just like you're over exaggerating stories or experiences, right? So like how do you like come up with the cadence? Like what's the like in a poem, like how do you feel like this is how is it like a rhythm thing, kind of like a song, or
I think for every artist it's very different on how they've evolved in finding a voice. Just speaking from my perspective, I knew I had found a voice or like the rhythm or the way I wanted to speak coming out of a background in performance poetry where you are scored. And so you needed to have your confidence in your voice where you can tell the story and convince 5 random judges that your story is important. And so what that means is you need to do like the roller coaster examination of when you're telling a story, when conflict comes in, when emotion comes in, when resolution comes in. And when you're doing that mapping, your voice can also play a role in helping mapping or intensifying or emotionally engaging an audience and telling a story. A lot of times when I do book readings and I'm reading a poem, the poem's going to have my body respond to what is being shared at that moment. So if it's a poem about joy, I'm going to be so happy about it. If it's a poem about, something that ain't so pretty from my childhood, the voice is going to be a little different, but always me, And so music plays a huge role too. And so I listened to a lot of Kendrick Lamar when I was writing this book, and just like listening to how musicians and artists rhythmically use language to create sound, because sound is also another tool or device to kind of engage an audience in listening, and then that's through the musicality of what you can create through sound.
And because like you were saying, like it all comes down to like the type of poem you're reading, because like you can I was looking at some of your readings and you can tell when it's a poem when you're like angry or trying to express some anger, and I kind of like, now that you like kind of like explain a little bit, I kind of get it. So, trying to wrap it up a little bit because we're almost at an hour. Where do you see yourself in like 5 or 10 years? Like, what's your ultimate goal?
5 or 10 years,
or like let's say 5 years to narrow it down to a.
5 or 10 years. I mean, I've always been whatever I say now may change, but I'm always a dreamer, and then always encouraged to dream bigger than the essential thought. And so my dream right now to continue in the next 5 years is to continue using my platform as an educator to transform the lives of my students. I think right now there's a lot of political and social chaos happening, a lot of media and pop culture that is instilling in our students on how they should navigate through the world. And so I think in 5 years is just continuing to develop and grow as an educator, where I can provide students with a sense of empowerment, continuing being an artist, whatever that journey or that calling looks like. So if it's writing more poems, if it's writing stories or fiction or creating a comic strip, I mean, I don't know, but I'm also really excited to see where art is going to take me, and excited to continue to travel and visit different schools and communities that want to hear this book, and continuing to create relations and working with the community and community organizing, and creating more platforms for folks that need that space to do so. Cool.
Well, a lot of kids just graduated or graduating this Friday. Calexico High School is graduating this Friday. And I think it's you're a good example of, how, the sky's the limit. I think you have achieved so much in, so little time, like compared to other people, like this will take them, a lot of time, like to get a book out there. be recognized in so many places that I think you're a good example for our community. Coming from our community, from Imperial Valley, from Calexico, and writing about the things we've experienced. I think it's an awesome example to all these young students going out to the real world the next couple of months. So I want to thank you for being here. I was super excited to talk to you because I know that we would talk for almost an hour and not even feel it.
Yeah, absolutely. You said that hour was gonna go by fast.
And it did, huh? You didn't think it was?
Yeah.
It does. It does when you're having fun. So thank you so much. Anything else that you would like to add that I didn't, touch upon?
Oh, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for doing what you do. It's so important that you're archiving the artistry that exists. It's been really exciting to see the episodes you have and the people that are coming out of the Imperial Valley and killing it and doing a lot of good work. I always just tell folks in anything and everything I do that please know, whoever's listening or yourself will say, that I am always a forever resource to our people in the Imperial Valley. I want to hear your stories. I want to collaborate. Please feel free to follow me on Instagram. My user is Karla with a K, Flaca with a K 13. My website is karlacordero.com. So anytime you need access to resources, please know I am always here. Even though I'm 2.5 hours away, I will drive 2.5 hours to help anybody and everybody with what they need support in.
And I mean, you don't even have to drive. You could always do this kind of thing,
This is true. We can always use technology.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm down with that.
All right, Karla, thank you so much once again. I'm super grateful that you took this time. I bet you're busy, and I bet you were excited yesterday that the Warriors won.
Hey, 1 point. We'll be back Thursday.
So thank you so much. Like I said, once again, and in the future, just like you said, you can use me as a resource for anything. Use my podcast for anything. I'm awesome. Here.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Alrighty. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.